He sees the bell before he sees the man. A small brass bell, tied to a rope, dragging through the dust. The law required it. Wherever a leper walked, the bell walked first, warning the world to clear the road. The young man on the horse hears it now, coming around the bend outside Assisi. And before he can stop himself, his stomach turns. The smell reaches him, sweet and rotten at once. The sores, the missing fingers wrapped in rags. Everything in him says, turn the horse around. He has spent his whole short life surrounded by silk and laughter, the favourite son of the richest cloth merchant in the city, a young man people already called the king of the feasts. He does not know yet what this moment is about to cost him, or what it will give him in return. He swings down from the horse anyway. He walks toward the bell, toward the smell, toward everything in him that wants to run. And when he reaches the leper, standing frozen in the road, Francis of Assisi takes the ruined hand in both of his own and kisses it. Chapter 1. The Heir of Assisi. Rewind a few years, and you would not recognize him. Francesco di Pietro di Bernardone was born around 1181, the son of Pietro Bernardone, a cloth merchant who had built a fortune importing French fabric into the hill town of Assisi. The family had money, and the boy was given everything money could buy: fine clothes, a soft bed, a crowd of friends who followed him from tavern to tavern. Francis spent his coins like a man trying to outrun something. Later in life, he would write plainly about who he had been, with none of the softening that often comes with age. While I was in sin, he confessed in his own testament, one of the few documents we have in his own words. The sight of lepers seemed bitter to him beyond anything else in the world. He went out of his way to avoid them. He held his breath at the gates of the leper hospital outside the city walls and hurried past. He wanted glory. And in Assisi, at the turn of the 13th century, glory still meant one thing: war. In 1202, Assisi went to battle against the neighbouring city of Perugia, and Francis rode out with the cavalry, dreaming of knighthood. The battle was a disaster. Francis was captured and spent nearly a year as a prisoner of war, locked in a cell, his body wasting under fever and his future uncertain. He came home changed, not yet converted but shaken. The fevers lingered. The old parties no longer satisfied him. Something in him had gone quiet, and he did not yet have words for what it was. He tried one more time for the glory he had always chased, riding out to join a papal military campaign in 1205. According to his earliest biographers, before he had gone more than a day's journey, he experienced a vivid dream that turned him back toward Assisi, and toward a question he could no longer outrun. Whom would he serve? The master or the servant? It was somewhere in this unravelling, friends said, that he began to murmur a prayer to himself in empty churches and lonely fields. Almost without realising, he was praying it: my God and my all. Chapter 2. The Voice from the Cross. The turning point came in a half-ruined chapel outside the city walls, a small stone church called San Damiano, abandoned and falling apart, its roof open to the rain. Francis had taken to wandering into chapels like this one, kneeling alone, unsure what he was even asking for. According to the earliest accounts of his life, written by men who had known him personally, he was praying before the painted crucifix above the altar at San Damiano, when he heard a voice speak to him from the cross itself. Francis, go and repair my house, which, as you see, is falling into ruin. He took it literally. He believed God was telling him to fix the building in front of him. He sold cloth from his father's warehouse without permission to pay for the repairs. And that decision broke whatever was left of his old life in two. His father was furious, not at the theology, but at the theft, and at the public humiliation of a son throwing away the family business for a crumbling chapel. Pietro Bernardone dragged Francis before the Bishop of Assisi to disinherit him formally, in front of the whole town. And there, in the public square, Francis did something no one expected. He took off his clothes, every stitch his father had ever bought him, and handed them back, piece by piece, until he stood in the square, wearing nothing but a borrowed cloak. Until now, I have called you my father on earth, he reportedly said. Now I can say without reserve, our Father, who art in heaven. The crowd did not see a saint that day. They saw a rich man's son who had lost his mind. Francis walked out of Assisi with nothing, and for the first time in his life, he was free. Chapter 3. Lady Poverty. He rebuilt San Damiano, stone by stone, carrying rubble on his own back, begging for the materials he could not afford. But the voice from the cross, he came to understand, had meant something larger than one chapel. The whole of Christ's church, in his eyes, needed rebuilding, not with mortar, but with lives lived in radical, deliberate poverty. He began to preach in the streets and the fields, dressed in a patched grey tunic, tied with a rope, eating whatever he was given, sleeping wherever he could find shelter. He called poverty his lady, Lady Poverty, and courted her the way other men courted brides, with total devotion. Other men began to follow him. A wealthy young nobleman named Bernard of Quintaval gave away his fortune to join him. A respected canon named Sylvester sold his stone to feed the poor and walked away from his position to live as Francis lived. Within a few years, 11 men in patched robes were walking the roads of Umbria together, owning nothing, begging for bread, and preaching repentance to anyone who would listen. In 1209 or 1210, Francis took this small, ragged brotherhood to Rome and asked Pope Innocent III for permission to live this way of life within the church. According to the earliest accounts, the Pope hesitated. The request was strange, even reckless, by the standards of the day, until a dream convinced him to grant it. Francis returned to Assisi with verbal approval to preach and to live according to what he called simply the gospel. The brothers had no monastery, no walls, no fixed rule beyond the words of Christ taken as literally as they could manage. They called themselves the Friars Minor, the Lesser Brothers, and they went out 2 by 2 into a world that did not know what to make of them. Chapter 4. The Sultan's Tent. By 1219, the brotherhood Francis had begun with 11 ragged men, numbered in the thousands, scattered across Italy and beyond. And Francis himself was walking toward the most dangerous chapter of his life. Europe was in the middle of the Fifth Crusade, and the Christian army was laying siege to the Egyptian city of Damietta. Francis travelled to the war camp, and, against the advice of nearly everyone around him, asked permission to cross enemy lines, alone, unarmed, carrying nothing but his faith, to meet the Muslim Sultan, Malik al-Kamil, face to face. Crusader soldiers had been crucified for less. Francis went anyway, accompanied by one companion, walking out of the Christian camp and into the desert toward an army that could kill him on sight. He was captured almost immediately and beaten before being brought before the Sultan's court. But Malik al-Kamil, by multiple historical accounts, was struck by the strange calm of the ragged friar standing before him with nothing to bargain with and nothing to fear. The two men spoke for days. Francis preached Christ to the Sultan without threat or flattery. The Sultan listened, debated him respectfully, and, according to the early sources, sent him back to the Christian camp unharmed, with gifts and safe passage. Francis did not convert the Sultan, and he did not stop the war. But he walked into the heart of an enemy empire, carrying nothing but a single conviction. Oh, and he walked back out alive. Brothers who had stayed behind, certain they would never see him again, said he returned changed once more, quieter, more focused, as if Egypt had stripped away whatever was left to strip. Chapter 5. The Mountain of Verna. By 1254, Francis was a man running out of strength. Years of fasting and exposure had ruined his eyes and his stomach. The order he had founded had grown so large, thousands of friars now, scattered across Europe, that he had stepped back from leading it, troubled by how far it had already drifted from the barefoot poverty of its first 11 brothers. He retreated that September to a remote mountain called Verna, a rocky outcropping given to the friars years earlier, to fast and pray alone for 40 days before the feast of St. Michael. His closest companion, Brother Leo, stayed nearby, but kept his distance, leaving Francis to wrestle with God in solitude. It was there, according to the testimony of Brother Leo and the friars closest to Francis, testimony considered among the best attested events in his life, that Francis received the wounds of Christ's crucifixion in his own body, marks in his hands, his feet, and his side, appearing during a vision of a seraph on the mountain. Brother Leo, who dressed Francis's wounds in the months that followed, left behind his own handwritten note describing what he witnessed. Francis himself rarely spoke of it, and tried for the rest of his life to keep the marks hidden beneath his sleeves. Whatever the precise nature of what happened on that mountain, the brothers who lived alongside Francis afterward were unanimous. He carried wounds for the remainder of his life that he had not carried before, and he bore them in silence, the way a man bears something too sacred and too painful to explain. Through it all, the fasting, the blindness creeping into his eyes, the wounds he hid beneath his sleeve, those closest to him said he kept returning, night after night, to the same whispered prayer he had carried since the empty churches of his youth. My God and my all. It was no longer a question. It had become an answer. Chapter 6. Sister Death. Francis lived less than 2 years after Verna. His eyesight failed almost entirely. Doctors in Rieti tried cauterizing his temples with a hot iron to relieve the pressure behind his eyes, a treatment so painful that even Francis, who had walked unarmed into a sultan's war camp, reportedly asked the fire itself to be gentle with him. Blind, in pain, and certain his death was near, Francis did something almost no one expected from a man who had spent his life renouncing comfort. He composed a song, the Canticle of the Sun, one of the earliest known poems in the Italian vernacular, and one of the few works we have entirely in his own words. Praised God through Brother Sun, Sister Moon, Brother Wind, and Sister Water, naming the whole created world as kin. In the final months, he added a new verse, one he had never planned to write. Praise for Sister Bodily Death, from whom no living man can escape. He had spent his whole life learning not to run from what frightened him: the leper on the road, the Sultan's war camp, his own father's rage. And now he turned to face the last and oldest fear of all, and called it sister. He died on the evening of October 3rd, 1226, at the small chapel of the Portiuncula near Assisi, the very chapel where his movement had first taken root, asking to be laid on the bare ground in his final hours. His bare feet, marked by the wounds he had carried for 2 years, the last thing his brothers saw before the candles were put out. Chapter 7. What he left behind. Within 2 years of his death, Francis was formally recognized as a saint of the Church, a remarkably swift response, even by the standards of the era, a reflection of how widely and how immediately his life had already been recognized as extraordinary by those who witnessed it. The order he founded with 11 barefoot men grew into one of the largest religious movements in Christian history, spreading from Italy across Europe and eventually around the world. Its friars known for centuries afterward for poverty, preaching, and care for the poor and the sick. His insistence on seeing the leper, the enemy, and the natural world itself as bearers of dignity reshaped how later generations of Christians thought about creation and the marginalized. Centuries later, his name would still be invoked whenever the Church needed to remember what it looked like to own nothing and trust everything. He never wrote a theological system. He never sought ordination as a priest. He left behind a handful of fragile documents, a song about the sun, and the memory of a rich man's son who once knelt in the road to kiss a hand that everyone else refused to touch. Most of us will never be asked to walk into a war camp or carry wounds we cannot explain. But somewhere in your life, there is a leper on the road, something you would rather ride past than face. Francis only became who he was the moment he got off the horse. History forgot them, but they were faithful, and now it's our turn to remember. Subscribe to Forgotten Heroes of Faith